Tustin Area Historical Society, and this is a presentation will be based on a talk I gave at the museum, and it's taken from a paper I wrote for the Historical Society about the small Japanese community in Tustin in the years leading up to World War II, and then what happened to them after Pearl Harbor and when we entered the war. So we'll first be looking at the location, the main location of that small Japanese community. And then after that, I will focus on the experience of the Japanese American students at Tustin High School. Then we will look at the removal and where the Japanese community in Tustin was sent. And then I'll finish up with a few biographical sketches of former Tustin High School students who, even though they and their families had been unjustly imprisoned, still served their country during the war. And before I get started, I'll just warn you that I am going to be reading some quotes, and there'll be some pictures up on the screen that use a derogatory term for the Japanese that was in common usage back then. And I think it's important to share that because it shows how widespread the prejudice was, and it shows what these Japanese people of California were dealing with in this time period. So having said that, we'll get started. This is a 1938 aerial photo showing the area around Browning and Bryan. It's from the Orange County Archives. And you see that small cluster of buildings to the bottom right. That was the largest concentration of Japanese families in the Tustin area at this time. For those of you familiar with the area, it's about where the parking lot for the synagogue is right now. And this was definitely the heart of the Japanese community of Tustin. In 1930 census, there were only 2 Japanese families here. But by 1940, 2 years after this picture was taken, you can see on that to the right there were 13 Japanese households living here. And all the men were listed as vegetable farmers, and they all leased the land that they farmed from the Irvine Company. There was also a Japanese language school on this site where the families would send their children on Saturdays to study Japanese language, culture, and history. And it wasn't just the families from this area that would send their children there. Any Japanese families in the area, including families from El Toro, San Juan Capistrano, San Clemente, would send their children here also. So it was definitely the main cultural area for the Japanese. Most of the families in this area, because Tustin was the nearest town, they would patronize the businesses and shops in Tustin, whether it be the bank, the hardware store, the feed store. And there were still 2 blacksmith shops in Tustin in 1940. So these men being farmers, I'm sure that they would use the blacksmith services also. But they also all sent their children to Tustin schools. And you'll see, I went through the census, and there was one other concentration of Japanese families living in the area. And that was the 5 families you see there that were living in farming in Peters Canyon. They comprised about 28 people, men, women, and children. The one in Browning and Bryan was about 65 people altogether. But they all sent their children to the Tustin schools. And I decided to focus my study on the Japanese of Tustin by looking at the students at Tustin High School. And I particularly focused on the students and families who I later found out that a child served in the Army during World War II. So that was my main focus. And so you'll see here, I tracked the population of the Tustin, Japanese American Tustin students at Tustin High for about a 20-year period from 1923 to 1943. Tustin High School opened in 1923. That was the inaugural year. And the young lady you see in this picture, Hanako Watanuki, had the distinction of being the first Japanese American graduate of Tustin High School. She was from the class of 1932. And I found it interesting that was her only year. Her senior year was spent at Tustin High. She came from La Puente. But even though she was new to the school, she was elected class treasurer that year. So she must have been a personable gal. So I thought I'd include her on here since she had that distinction. So as I was looking at the numbers of students at Tustin High School, and how they increased through the years, it made me realize that um, the these numbers kind of reflected the pattern of Japanese immigration to California in the years prior to this. And to explain that, um, Japanese immigration to Tustin began in the 1890s. And in fact, in that entire decade, about 1,000 Japanese came to California each year, and that continued into the first couple years of the new century. So that but they were mostly all young single men coming here to work. So that by the 1910 census, 90% of the Japanese in California were men. Some of them had been here 10, 12, 15 years. And at some point, they decided they were accomplished enough or settled enough to send for wives. And so, what many of them would do, they would dress up in a suit and tie, have their picture taken looking very prosperous, and they would send that back to their hometown village, to their family, who would then search around for a suitable bride for them. And once one was found, they would arrange for a marriage, and the woman often would reciprocate and send her picture back to the man. And from this practice came the title of picture brides. And then the woman would come over, of course, by ship in those days, and the man would meet her right at the ship and marry her right then. They did this to comply with the immigration laws that were existed at that time. The men were only allowed to bring over a wife or children. So that's the way they got around that. And I found that most of the Tustin families that I researched practiced this picture bride practice. I would find a ship's passenger list showing the woman arriving on a certain date, and then I would find a marriage record, and almost always that date would be the same. The arrival date and the marriage date would be the same date. And later on, years later, once they were eligible for citizenship, if the woman applied for citizenship, it made my research easier because the naturalization records all on one page would show arrival and marriage, and invariably it was the same date. I say majority, but not all of the families I researched fell under this category. There were a couple Tustin families that I looked into where the man actually went back to Japan, got married, and brought his bride back with him. Now, the reason I say this practice fit into those numbers of the students, this practice of the picture bride became more prevalent in the mid and late teens into the early 1920s. So these women were coming over in those years, having children, but in the 1920s, those children were not yet old enough to attend high school. But as you see, starting in the middle 30s on up through the late 30s, early 40s, all these children that were being born were now high school age, until they hit a peak of 31 Japanese American students in 1940 and 41. And while that doesn't seem like a real large number, you have to remember Tustin High School was a pretty small school at that time. And so 31 actually represented 10% of the entire student body, making these Japanese American students by far the largest minority group at the school. And so what were they doing at Tustin High School? They were doing what most first generation American children of immigrants have always done. They were assimilating into the mainstream culture. And I really believe that high school was a really great incubator for assimilation because there were so many different ways for the children to participate and fit in. And sports was one of the main ways. You know, you play on a sports team, you have teammates, you're accepted. And the Japanese American boys at Tustin High School really took this path. They played basketball, baseball, football, ran track, played on the tennis team. And in fact, by 1940, fully 1/3 of the Tustin varsity football team was Nisei, or first generation Japanese. 8 out of the 24 players, and you see some of them here. And like I said, it was not just football. They participated in all the sports. Here you see, I believe that's the night on the bottom, that's the 1941 school tennis team, and you can see it's predominantly Japanese American. And it wasn't just the boys. The girls played too, but there weren't as many opportunities for them. This was pre-Title IX, so there weren't as many girls' sports. I found them mostly on the tennis team and basketball team, as you see here. But it wasn't just sports, too. These students really embraced the entire high school experience. They served in student government. Uh, they were on the yearbook staff. They played in the band. They sang in the glee club. Uh, they they wore the popular fashions, sported the current hairstyles. In short, they were just becoming as American as apple pie. And then December 7, 1941 hit with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And within a few short months, all this would end. There would not be a Japanese American student left at the school. And another one would not enroll for almost 20 years. And so that takes us to this period of the removal of the Japanese from the West Coast. And to me, it brings up the question of how, how in a country that prides itself on its rule of law, its constitution, due process, the concept that you're innocent until proven guilty, how did 120,000 people, the majority of them citizens, how were they removed from their homes and imprisoned without ever being indicted, charged, or convicted of any crime? And I know the catalyst for this, of course, was the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. The shock of that, the fear it engendered. And the only thing I can probably compare that to my own lifetime would be the 9/11 attacks, terrorist attacks. But I knew there had to be something more that would allow and even encourage people to accept this removal of their neighbors. And in my research, I did find that there was about a 40-year period of anti-Japanese sentiment, propaganda, legislation, I think that helped pave the way to accept this removal so easily. And we're going to look at that just real quickly here. As I mentioned, the Japanese immigration started in the 1890s, went through the early part of the century. And that was about the same time Japan was emerging as a world power. They had fought China in the 1890s, and then in 1904, 1905, they defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. President Teddy Roosevelt would become the first president to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering that peace. But on the same year that war ended, the Asiatic Exclusion League was formed in San Francisco. And it called for the Japanese to be included in the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in fact, it lobbied for years to have a ban of Japanese immigration. In late 1907, early 1908, President Roosevelt brokered another agreement known as the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. It was an unwritten agreement where Japan, to save face, voluntarily agreed to limit immigration to the U.S., while the U.S. agreed to protect the rights of the Japanese who were already here, because there have been some incidents of violence against Japanese here in California. And it was also from this agreement that the picture bride practice came about, because it was this part of this gentleman's agreement that only wives and children could come over. Obviously, this gentleman's agreement didn't appease most Californians, because in 1909 alone, 17 anti-Japanese bills were introduced into the California legislature. They covered everything from segregation in public schools, prevention of land ownership, segregation in housing, business restrictions. But then it was interesting. In 1910, the California Labor Commissioner investigated the Japanese farmers in California. He wrote a glowing report praising them, saying that they were great stewards of the land, they would make great citizens. But that wasn't the narrative that the politicians wanted to put out. So the state Senate squashed this report and never released it. And then 3 years later came the big one, officially known as the Webb-Heaney Act. It's commonly known as the Alien Land Act of 1913. And this made people ineligible for citizenship could not own land. It was directly aimed at the Japanese, because at this time the immigration laws said that only free white persons were eligible for citizenship, which ruled out the Japanese. And it also had a clause in that act where they could only lease land for a 3-year period. So this also factored into my study of the students at Tustin High. Many of them, in fact, very few of them, went to Tustin for all 4 years. And I think that's because after a 3-year period, their families, if they couldn't find land to lease in the same district, had to move on. A few years later, 1916, the Hearst newspapers, which were virulently anti-Japanese, they published a big banner story saying that Japan planned to invade California. They said there were 100,000 Japanese in Mexico waiting to invade. And this was kind of a common theme that popped up often, stirring people up. It was completely false. It would be one of those things today called fake news, but it kept people stirred up against the Japanese. This kind of died down during World War I because Japan was our ally in World War I. But you can see by the next entry that the war ended in 1918, and by 1919, the next year, a powerful group was formed called the Joint Immigration Committee. And it was anti-Japanese, and for years it sponsored anti-Japanese propaganda. And it was supported by some powerful organizations, the Native Sons of the Golden West, the Grange, which was a farming group, the State Federation of Labor, and even the newly formed American Legion. And the following year, the Alien Land Act was amended, closing some of the loopholes in the earlier act. That same year, several novels with anti-Japanese themes became bestsellers in California, and the American Legion produced and released a film vilifying the Japanese. 2 years later came a big Supreme Court decision. Takeo Ozawa was a UC Berkeley student who challenged the 1913 Land Act on the idea of the free white person, but the Supreme Court ruled against him, saying that the Japanese were not part of the white race and therefore ineligible for citizenship. So 2 years later, this was used in the big U.S. Immigration Act, a federal act, the first big comprehensive immigration act in our history. It provided quotas, but as far as the Japanese, it excluded them from immigration entirely because it cut off immigration to anybody who was not eligible for citizenship, which, of course, with that 1922 ruling, confirmed that the Japanese, being non-white, weren't eligible. And the anti-Japanese propaganda and sentiment continued throughout the 1920s and 30s. Anybody who's ever done any research in the newspapers will see most of the stories were negative. They were framed negatively against the Japanese. And I do want to quote from a editorial in a California newspaper in 1935, 11 years after Japanese immigration was barred. They were still pounding on the Japanese. Here's a quote from 1935 editorial. Wherever the Japanese have settled, their nests pollute the communities like running sores of leprosy. They exist like the yellowed, smoldering, discarded butts in an overfull ashtray, vilifying the air with their loathsome smells, filling all who have the misfortune to look upon them with wholesome disgust and a desire to wash. So with years and years of this type of vilifying and dehumanizing and marginalizing of the Japanese in California, it makes it easier to understand how people were so easily willing to accept and approve of their removal and incarceration after Pearl Harbor. And so now what happened right after Pearl Harbor? Well, immediately, even on the day of Pearl Harbor, the FBI swung into action and they rounded up and arrested some 1,200 prominent Japanese in California on the West Coast. These were men like prominent businessmen, clergy, teachers, any leaders of Japanese cultural organizations. They were rounded up and they were sent to arrested and sent to Department of Justice camps prison camps all over the country. And several fathers in Tustin families were swept up in this initial burst. And one of them, at least, did not see his family again was not reunited with him for about a year and a half after this. After those initial sweeps, houses were systematically searched, as you can see in this picture. Any guns, any weapons were confiscated, any knives over 3 inches long. All Japanese reading material was taken, including even Japanese language Bibles. They were looking for, I guess, coded hidden messages. And then after a while, it calmed down a bit for several weeks. But then in January of 1942, California Press once again ratcheted up its anti-Japanese stories. They would daily put out stories of Japanese sabotage and spying, both here and in Hawaii. A fifth column, they said, was waiting to rise up, all of which was proved to be false. But at the time, it had people agitated. Even the comic strips of this time, as I was researching, had daily themes of Japanese getting ready to rise up. And I picked this one for two reasons. For one, it shows the stereotypical portrayal of the Japanese at that time with the the thick glasses, the buck teeth. And you can see here they're all lined up getting dynamite, waiting. And then the one guy's waiting for the signal from home to start blowing things up. But the second reason I picked it is if you look down at the bottom right, who the author of this cartoon was. It was Dr. Seuss. So even our beloved Dr. Seuss got into the anti-Japanese bashing at this time. So President Roosevelt back in Washington was getting pressure from the West Coast to remove the Japanese. The entire California delegation in Washington at one time descended on him, asking him to remove them. The Attorney General at that time of California, soon to be governor, and then, of course, future Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren was also leading the charge for removal. The general in charge, General John DeWitt, the man in charge of the Army on the West Coast, virulently anti-Japanese, was also calling for their removal. But FDR held out for a while because he was also getting conflicting reports. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI of all people, said there was no reason to remove them. He had already taken care of what he considered the ringleaders, and he said that his FBI could handle anything else. We had already broken the Japanese diplomatic code, and we were reading messages from their embassy in Washington back to Tokyo, telling them, don't count on any help from our people here. They're more loyal to America. They no longer, they're traitors. They're no longer loyal to the emperor. And then FDR sent his own envoy, a man named Munson, out to the West Coast to investigate. And he came back and he told FDR that in his opinion, 95 to 98% of the Japanese on the West Coast were loyal to this country. But even with all that, FDR finally caved in to the political and military pressure. And on February 19, 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066. And this Executive Order 9066 authorized the Army to create military districts. And then the big thing is it gave the Army then authorization to either remove or ban anybody from those military districts. And with DeWitt in charge, this just gave a green light for the removal of Japanese people from the West Coast. To give you some idea of General DeWitt's mindset, I'll read probably his most famous quote. He was asked at this time if it was not possible that there were some Japanese and Japanese Americans who could be considered loyal citizens. And his reply, quote, was, "A Jap is a Jap is a Jap. Even if born in America, they can never be assimilated and they can never be trusted." So with a guy like that in charge, the writing was on the wall for the removal. Another disturbing quote came from the Assistant Secretary of State, John McCloy, who was also instrumental in organizing the removal. When he was asked at a press conference about the constitutionality of locking people up without due process, he replied, quote, "We're at war. The Constitution is just a scrap of paper to me." So that really shows you the mindset of the people who are going to be in charge of deciding. And of course, they did. General DeWitt finally made the order in March of 1942, which began the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. The people first went to temporary assembly centers, and these were usually racetracks, fairgrounds, parks. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, but they figured, oh, this is just going to be temporary while the regular camps are being built. If you go up and down California right now, you'll see one of these. This is an official California historical marker. And anywhere where these assembly centers were, you'll see one of these. I took this picture at the Fresno Fairgrounds. And it's interesting that all other California historical markers have individual numbers, but all of the ones for the assembly centers, they share the same number 934. But I thought it would be more symbolic if they had given him the number 9066, but unfortunately that wasn't to be. So once the removal began, some people were given as little as 48 hours to get their affairs in order, and they could only bring with them what they could carry. So unless they could find somebody to take care of their property, their land, or unless they could find a place to store their furniture, many were forced to sell their property on pennies on the dollar. They sold their homes, their cars, their shops, businesses, all at a great loss. This was really a tragic time. There's some very heartbreaking stories that come out of this period. There's the story of the orphanage in Los Angeles, where authorities went in and they removed every child with Japanese features. And the director of the orphanage, he finally asked him, "Hey, what's the criteria here? I mean, some of these kids are only 1/8 Japanese." And he was told that if they have 1 ounce of Jap blood, they're going. Also in Los Angeles, they searched and they found the Caucasian families who had adopted Japanese children and tore them away from their new families and sent them to the camps. I don't know. I hope there were provisions made. I don't know who was supposed to take care of these orphans once they got there, but I was hoping I never did find out, but I hope that they made provisions for that. Elderly Japanese, some of them who were on their deathbeds in hospitals, the Army put armed guards at their hospital doors, where they would stay until the person either died or became well enough to be moved to a camp. It just shows you the war hysteria, the mindset that people weren't really thinking. I mean, what threat could these children or somebody on their deathbed possibly be? The pictures you see here were taken by the famous Depression era photographer Dorothea Lange. She was up in Northern California, so that's where these pictures come from. Probably, to me, the most tragic story of this period of the removal was of a man up in Monterey. He was a Japanese immigrant. He had served in the U.S. Army during World War I. And when he returned, the Monterey Board of Supervisors issued a proclamation and gave it to him, thanking him for his service to his adopted country. So when the removal order came out, he took his proclamation and he went to the Monterey County Sheriff and he showed him the proclamation. He said, "You can't mean me, can you?" He goes, "I fought for this country." And the sheriff told him, "Sorry, no exceptions. Everybody has to go." And this man went home. He put on his old Army uniform and then he shot himself. And he was found later with the proclamation clutched in his other hand. Just one of the tragic stories coming from this very difficult time. So removal day for the people of Tustin was known as Evacuation Day, was May 17th, 1942. And none of the people from Tustin, Japanese people, or from Orange County in general, I found, went to a temporary assembly center. They went directly to the camps. And so when I found out May 17, 1942 was the date for the people of Tustin, I went to the newspapers. I was sure I was going to find a big headline and maybe even some pictures that I could scan and include in this presentation. But when I got there, all I found was this. And I'm not sure was more disturbing to me, the headline itself or the fact that such a momentous event didn't even rate a headline. This was at the bottom of the page, very bottom of the page, 2 paragraphs. And here's over 1,500 of your neighbors, friends, classmates, teammates being ripped from their home and sent to, it says right there, a concentration camp in the desert. And it doesn't even rate a headline or a photo. I found that very surprising. The first map on your left, the color-coded map, it shows you, depending on where you lived, which one of the concentration camps you would go to. And you see the big purple part in the bottom of the state, and it also bleeds over into Arizona. That's where the people from Tustin shows that they all went to the camp in Poston, Arizona. And you can see the map on the right shows all the 10 different what they called internment camps, where now the more common usage now is concentration camps. So the people of Tustin went to the Poston camp, which was officially known as Colorado River Relocation Center. It was about 26 miles from Parker, Arizona, on land belonging to the Colorado River tribes. And now these tribes, they weren't happy about having the Japanese here, and it was nothing against the Japanese. They just didn't want to be complicit in doing something to another people that had been done to them for many years. But the government, claiming wartime necessity, did it. And because it was on these lands, the government did not have to follow due process, which was a big reason for that. At its peak, Poston had 17,000 prisoners. You can see the barracks there, making it one of the larger cities in Arizona at the time. And the memories of the Poston prisoners, they tended to center around wind, dust, and heat. I'm now going to read a few quotes from people's first impressions of arriving at Poston. One man wrote, "Extreme heat that can melt iron. No trees, no flowers, no birds singing, not even the sound of an insect. Sandy dust swirled into the sky, completely taking the sunlight from us." Another wrote sarcastically, "Poston would be paradise if not for the dust, heat, wind, and insects." One man wrote of his arrival at the barracks after a long bus ride through the desert. "It was so hot, over 110 degrees, that people were getting sick. So we opened the windows. Immediately, everyone was covered by dust. I know you won't believe this, but it's really true. Friends couldn't even recognize one another." And then a final quote, and this is not so much of the physical problem, but of the mental anguish. One young man wrote, "You never thought this thing could happen to you, but it has, and you feel all tangled up inside because you do not quite understand the logic of having to surrender your freedom in a country that sincerely believes you believe is fighting for freedom." So, being a small city with that many people, there were also thousands of children at Poston. So they had to organize schools. And also with thousands of teenagers, they realized that they had to keep, with not much to do, so they had to keep them busy. So sports came in again. They formed baseball, football, and basketball leagues. They played against other barrack groups. There's a great book that came out a few years ago called The Eagles of Heart Mountain, and it's about the Heart Mountain camp in Wyoming that had some really great Los Angeles area high school athletes that put together a football team and defeated many of the public teams in Wyoming and Montana. But it's also about much more than that. It's about the whole dynamics of the camp experience. I'd highly recommend it. So here's Poston today. I took these pictures a couple years ago, and it was early May, and it was already getting really toasty out there. So I can't imagine how absolutely miserable hot it must have been to be out there in the middle of the summer in those uninsulated, obviously unair-conditioned barracks. It had to be just incredibly uncomfortable. There's no buildings like there are at Manzanar, no museum, no interpretive center, just the monument here. And I would draw your attention to the picture on the right. That has a listing of 25 young men from Poston who gave their lives during the war. And when I saw this, it just made me think, anytime a parent received that telegram telling them that they had lost, their child had been killed in action, it had to be just heartbreaking. But I can't imagine the conflicting emotions going through the minds of the parents who received that telegram that their son was killed fighting for this country when they were here behind barbed wire with machine gun towers. It had to just be a very, very, very conflicting emotions going through them at that time. But what this plaque also shows is that, yes, the Japanese Americans did serve the country in World War II. In fact, at the time of Pearl Harbor, there were almost 5,000 Japanese American men already in the Army. But shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, about 3,000 of those were discharged. But then in January of 1943, the government decided they could re-enlist again. And they really expected a big rush from all the men in these camps to enlist. And they were disappointed when only 1,000 men out of the 10 camps enlisted, 260 of them from Poston. But I'm sure this early on, I think there were still some very hard feelings about their treatment. Then in January of 1944, they were made eligible for the draft. And this caused some problems. There was some pushback against it. Some of them resisted, and some of them ended up in Leavenworth. But by and large, most of them complied. And by the end of the war, some 33,000 Japanese American men and women served in the U.S. Armed Forces. And over 800 of them made the ultimate sacrifice and gave their lives. So in 1943, when the Army started accepting enlistments again from Japanese Americans, they formed a unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And these are some pictures of it over in Europe. It served mainly in Italy and in southern France. And Per capita and per time of service, it ended up being the most decorated U.S. Army unit of World War II. Um, Many people have heard of the Lost Battalion of World War I fame. There's actually been several movies made about it, but there was actually a Lost Battalion in World War II also. It was made up of Texas National Guard troops, and it was cut off and surrounded by the Germans on a high point on a mountain in southern France. And the Army thought there was no way they were going to be able to rescue them, but they did send some units from the 442nd to try. And it took them 5 days and nights of consecutive fighting going uphill, but they finally broke through and they rescued those Texas soldiers. And it cost the 442nd 800 casualties to rescue those 211 Texans. As I said, they were the most decorated U.S. Army unit of the war. And here's a list of their medals you can see. The Statue of Liberty's torch was their shoulder patch, which I thought was very fitting since they were all sons of immigrants. Not that they necessarily came through New York Harbor, but they were all sons of immigrants. And you see on that medal count 21 Medal of Honor recipients. But actually, during the war, only one member of the 442nd received the Medal of Honor. The rest of them came after the war when it was realized that so many of them that had been put in for the Medal of Honor didn't receive it. And they think that was due to the racial prejudice. So they were upgraded after the war to that total of 21. Today, if you go to Evergreen, the oldest cemetery in Los Angeles, you'll see this really nice monument to the 442nd. You see there's quotes on both sides. One has a quote from General Eisenhower. The other side has a quote from General Mark Clark, who was in charge of the Fifth Army in Italy, where, for the most part, the 442nd served. And you'll see, if you look down at the base of the monument to the left in this picture, you'll see the flag at that one grave. And that is the grave of the one man who received the Medal of Honor during the war. And unfortunately, he received it posthumously. He was killed in action over in Italy. His name was Sadao Munamori. And he had just wiped out a couple German machine gun nests single-handedly. He ran back, he jumped, dived in his foxhole, but unfortunately a German hand grenade followed him into the foxhole, and he didn't hesitate. He dived on it, covered it with his body. He was killed instantly, but he saved the other men in his foxhole. If you go to Little Tokyo today in downtown Los Angeles on First Street, you'll see this memorial to the 442nd called the Go for Broke Memorial. That was their motto: go for broke. Let it all hang out. Don't hold anything back. But the monument is also to all of the different Japanese American units that served in the war. You can see their logos kind of a little bit going across the top there. And then on the back of this monument is a listing of all the names of all the Japanese Americans who served in the war. And right next to it is a really nice Go for Broke museum that tells the story, not just of the 442nd, but the whole Japanese experience of the internment and that. And I would highly recommend it. So the reason I've been speaking so much about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, not only because it's an interesting part of the Japanese experience in World War II, but because I'm now going to start looking at some of the former Tustin High students who served in World War II, and the first 6 we're going to look at actually served in the 442nd. First here is Yukito Murakami. He's from the Tustin High class of 1935. His family lived and farmed in Rattlesnake Canyon, which is now underwater. It's part of the Rattlesnake Dam and Reservoir. You can see him on the basketball team on the picture on the top there. He's the 5th from the left on the top row. He played basketball, baseball, ran track. He was one of those men who was already in the Army at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, and he was discharged. He came back here with this, to Tustin, and then he was sent to Poston with his family. But then in 1943, when they were allowed to enlist again, he was one of those men who re-enlisted. He was part of the 100th Battalion of the 442nd. He was wounded twice over in Italy, so he received the Purple Heart with an oak leaf cluster. And his last wounding was in April of 1945. He was struck in the stomach by fragments of an artillery shell, which effectively took him out of the war. He recovered. He came home. He married a lady he had met in Poston. Tried farming in Watsonville for a while, but then they came back to Orange County, where he eventually became one of the most successful strawberry growers. For a long time, he had 30 acres in Irvine, Murakami Farms, before he retired in 1993. He was one of the charter members of the Masuda VFW post in Garden Grove, and he passed away in 2000 at the age of 83. Our next soldier is Mitsugi Kasuda, and he was born in 1920, Sunset Beach, California, and he was the third of 4 children born to Gonzo Kasuda and Yoshi Nishino. And his father came over in 1904 to Hawaii, and then 1906 to California. And then around 1914 or 15, he went back to Japan and married Yoshi and brought her back here in 1916. The family moved around quite a bit before settling in the Tustin area in the early 1930s. They were one of the families that lived out in Peters Canyon. And Mike Kasuda here, he attended Tustin High School for all 4 years. He was another athlete, participated in all the sports. Here you see him. He's the man in the front row with the baseball bats crossed against his chest. After graduating in the class of 1939, he was attending UC Davis when he enlisted in the Army at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro in February of 1942, just several months after Pearl Harbor. And then 3 months after his enlistment, his family was sent to Poston. So in the early months of the war, those Japanese Americans who weren't discharged were given menial kind of labor-related tasks, non-combat roles. So after his basic training, Mike was sent to Camp Grant, Illinois, and assigned to the hospital and then later the bakery. But he eventually transferred to the 442nd, where he served as a private in Company E. After training in Camp Robinson, Arkansas, he went overseas in August of 1944, and he served as a battalion runner and a radio operator for the 442nd in Italy and in France. After the war, he returned to Orange County, where he would live for the rest of his life. He had attended UC Davis before the war, and he was later awarded an honorary degree by UC Davis. He married in 1952, and he and his wife would eventually have 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. And for many years, he ran the Garden Grove nursery and flower shop with his siblings. And he was very involved in the community, youth sports, scouting. He was an outdoorsman. He enjoyed fishing and golf. And he was also a founding member of the Masuda Lodge, VFW post in Garden Grove. And he passed away in 2011 at the age of 91, and he's buried at Riverside National Cemetery. Next, we'll look at Masato Matt Kahara. And Matt was born in 1920 in Belvedere Gardens, which I learned was an unincorporated area in East Los Angeles. And his parents were Masaki Kahara and Somo Honda. And they were living in Roland Heights near Los Angeles in 1930, but eventually moved to the Tustin area. And they lived out at a place called Gould Canyon, which was off of Irvine Boulevard, north of Irvine Boulevard, right where Culver runs into it. They farmed that area. And Masato was a 1940 graduate of Tustin High School. He was quarterback on the football team. He ran track. He played in the band. He was a member of the Letterman's Club and the Spanish Club. And the year after graduation, he married a Tustin High student, and they had a son. And so when they were removed to Poston, he went there with his wife and his infant son. But then he remained there until 1944 when he enlisted in the Army. He served as a private in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, first stationed at Camp Hood, Texas, before he went overseas in March of 1945, where he served in Italy with the 442nd. He was discharged in 1946 and came back to Southern California. Sadly, he passed away in 1964 at the age of 44. He suffered a stroke and passed away at a very young age. And there you see him on the football team, and then he's at the back row left on the track team in 1940. So next, we're going to look at Tom Watanuki. And Tom was from the Tustin High class in 1941. the youngest of 6 children. And his father came to California in 1890. He was the earliest of any of the Tustin men that I saw come to California. And he was the one who was here for 23 years before he sent for a bride. At Tustin High, Tom played football, ran track, and he was a class vice president his junior year. And after graduation, he went to work in Idaho. And while he was up there in Idaho, his family was sent to the Santa Anita Assembly Center in Arcadia at the racetrack. They were the only Tustin-related family I found that went to an assembly center, and I think they may have moved up to Los Angeles after leaving Tustin, and that's why they went there. He came back down here, and he was sent with them to the Gila River Relocation Center at Saccatone, Arizona. Once again, it's the only Tustin related family I saw that didn't go to Poston. The Gila River Relocation Center is on another reservation in Arizona. It's most known for being the home of Ira Hayes, the famous one of the flag raisers on Iwo Jima. If you go there now, there's a park named for him and a statue. But Tom stayed there until 1944 when he enlisted in the Army, and he served in the 442nd, and he rose to the rank of Staff Sergeant before he was discharged. Came back to Southern California, raised a family, passed away in 2011 at the age of 89, and he is buried at Riverside National Cemetery. And you can see his grave there at Riverside has the Go for Broke 442nd logo. And the picture above that is the monument at the Gila River camp for the Gila River camp. You can see it's out in the desert too. Next, we have George Kaihara. He was the younger brother of Masato that we looked at earlier. And George went to Poston with his family in May of 42. He remained there until 1944 when he was inducted into the Army at Fort Douglas, Utah. And he served as a private first class in the 171st Infantry Battalion separate. The 171st was originally the 1st Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but it was left behind at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, as a training cadre for new soldiers of the 442nd. So that's where George served. In addition to Camp Shelby, he was later sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia. And I was not able to find if he had gone overseas with the 442nd or not. He was discharged in October of 1945. He's number 40 up there in the basketball picture, by the way. After his discharge, George moved back to Long Beach, where he lived with his parents and worked as a nurseryman. Then he met up with a former classmate, Miko Nakamura. They were married in 1950, and they would remain married for 65 years, have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. And I'm going to come back to George and Miko later near the end of this presentation. So the final member of the 442nd that went to Tustin High School was Lawrence Awaki. And Lawrence was also a class in 1941. He was born up in the Gold Country above Sacramento. Rockland was the name of the place. But the family made their way down here. At Tustin, he played baseball, football, basketball. He was sent to Poston with the family. He left there in 1944 for Detroit, probably to find work, but then he enlisted, and he served in the 442nd. He was wounded, received the Purple Heart. He received the Bronze Star for meritorious service. After the war, he came back, but he did move around quite a bit, but eventually settled back in the Sacramento area where he was born. And he died up there in 2013 at the age of 89, and he's buried at Sacramento Valley National Cemetery. And he also, you can see, he also has the Go for Broke logo on his headstone. So Lawrence had a younger sister, and she was a member of the Cadet Nurse Corps. So I'm going to share a little bit about that Nurse Corps right now. The Cadet Nurse Corps, the United States Cadet Nurse Corps, was authorized by an act of Congress and signed into law by President Roosevelt on July 1st, 1943. And the program was designed to alleviate the nursing shortage brought on by the war. It was open to all women between the ages of 17 and 35 who had graduated from an accredited high school. And it provided free training, room and board for these women. And you can see by these ads, it was very military oriented. It was a way that women could feel like they were serving the war effort. And in its 5 years of existence, over 179,000 women enrolled in the program. And there was a clause in the act that prohibited discrimination against race, creed, or color. However, of the over 1,100 nursing schools and hospitals that participated nationwide, only 70 opened their enrollment to Japanese American women. Their reasoning was that belief that the hospital staffs and patients wouldn't trust them. But eventually, about 400 Nisei women would participate in the program, and 2 of them were former Tustin High School students. The first one we're going to look at is Lawrence's sister, Toshiko Iwaki. And Toshiko was nearing the end of her sophomore year at Tustin High in 1942 when she was removed with her family to Poston. And she stayed there until February of 1945 when she left for Rochester, Minnesota, where she spent 3 years at the Kaler Nursing School, which was attached to the Mayo Clinic. After leaving there, she went out to the state of Washington, and she graduated from Washington University in 1951. She married a fellow University of Washington graduate Henry J. Ishitani, who had served as a medic in the 442nd. And Toshiko made good use of her nursing training. She worked her entire career as a nurse before retiring in 1991. She lived up in Portland almost all that time, and she and Henry are buried at the Willamette National Cemetery in Portland. The other Tustin student who served in the Cadet Nursing Corps was Tomiko Kitasaki. And Tomiko was one of those families that was living at Browning and Bryan that we saw right at the beginning. And her father was one of those men who was detained right after Pearl Harbor and sent to the Bismarck, North Dakota Department of Justice prison. And he was the one who did not see his family again for over a year and a half. He was reunited with them at Poston in July of 1943. So Tomiko stayed in Poston until February of 1945 when she left for St. Paul, Minnesota. And she stayed there in the nursing program for 3 years until 1948 when she returned to Orange County and lived with her parents in Huntington Beach. And then she worked as a registered nurse until 1953 when she married Ko Takahashi. You see him up on the right there. He's the man cutting the celery with the sunglasses on. So Ko had been at Poston too, and he was a farmer. And so Tomiko's 2 sisters, Chiyoko and Tomoko, they also married local farmers. And the 3 families, they formed somewhat of a farming co-op. They worked 3 farms, one located on New Hope and First in Santa Ana, the other at Westminster Boulevard and Harbor in Garden Grove, and then the third at New Hope and Warner in Fountain Valley. And they constructed a large greenhouse on one of the properties where they grew tomato seedlings and other seedlings for their vegetables. And the 3 sisters were put in charge of the greenhouse and did that for many years. Ko Takahashi passed away in 2002, and he's buried over right near Tomiko's parents at Fairhaven. But as of 2019, Tomiko was still alive at the age of 95, and hopefully she's still with us. So the next Japanese American military organization I want to talk about is the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS. Here you see some pictures of them in action. The Army had anticipated for a number of years that they were going to go to war with Japan, and they knew it needed competent linguists for intelligence work. But it waited until November of 1941, 1 month before Pearl Harbor, before it opened a Japanese language school in an old hangar at the Presidio in San Francisco. And it was an intensive course that was supposed to last a year, but due to the war, it was cut short. The graduates of this school were part of the secret military intelligence service, or MIS. The graduates were then attached to Army and Marine units throughout the Pacific Theater, and they provided translation, interrogation, and interpretation services for these units. And besides that, they often volunteered to lead patrols into the jungle and bring back the bodies of wounded and dead soldiers. Another important aspect of their job was trying to trap Japanese soldiers and civilians out of caves where they were hiding. The jobs of these Nisei soldiers was even more perilous because of the possibility of being mistaken for enemy soldiers or the certainty of torture and death if they were captured. But by the end of the war, there were over 6,000 Nisei, including 300 women serving in the MIS. And President Harry Truman called the Japanese Americans in the MIS, quote, the human secret weapon for the U.S. Armed Forces against Japan in the Pacific. And General Charles Willoughby, who was the head of General MacArthur's intelligence unit, said that, quote, the Nisei shortened the war by 2 years and probably saved 1 million lives. And so the next two soldiers we look at from Tustin served in the MIS. These pictures here, you see them, some of them in action over in the Pacific, interrogating captured soldiers. The logo there you see on the bottom right, that's actually a gopher wearing a Indian war bonnet. And shortly after the language school was opened in the Presidio in San Francisco, it was moved to Minnesota because when the soldiers in San Francisco left the base or went on leave, they were being harassed. So they moved it way far inland to Minnesota, which was known as the Gopher State, and it was on land that was belonging to the Lakota Sioux. So one of the members of the MIS there was a former Disney animator, so he drew this gopher with an Indian headdress on, and it was very popular among the members of the MIS. Here you see today that hangar is a museum on the Presidio. You can see the historic marker for it. And that picture on the left is actually soldiers inside that hangar on the Presidio in the language school. So the first MIS member from Tustin High we're going to look at is Ieso Ace Kasuda. And he has a real fascinating story. He's the older brother of Mitsugi Kasuda we looked at from the 442nd. And Ace, as he was called, was a member of the Tustin High School class of 1937. And while he was there, he played football, baseball, ran track. And after high school, he attended Santa Ana Junior College, and then he studied at UC Davis School of Agriculture, where he graduated with a degree in ornamental horticulture. And he had a job lined up with Armstrong Nurseries, but then he was drafted in the summer of 1941. And he first went to Camp Roberts for basic training, and then he was sent to the Presidio and assigned as a medic to the base hospital. But quickly from there, he was recruited into the language school of the MIS. And he graduated with the first class of the language school on May 1st. And on May 7, 1942, he sailed with a detachment of other MIS students, graduates, for the island of New Caledonia. And his departure was just 10 days before his family was removed to the concentration camp at Poston. The interpreters worked in two-man teams, and Ace was paired with a man named Shigeru Yamashita, Shig as he was called. Shig was born on the Irvine Ranch, where his parents were tenant farmers. But he was sent to Japan in 1921 when he was only 3 years old to live with his grandparents. And he returned to the United States after graduating from high school in Japan in 1937. So Ace was strong in English, and Shig, of course, having been educated in Japan, was much stronger in Japanese. So they were the team that was selected to go to Guadalcanal, while the rest of their team remained in New Caledonia, and they would work on the documents that Shig and Ace sent back, things like maps, diaries, letters that they took from Japanese soldiers over there. They arrived on Guadalcanal by PT boat, but they didn't receive a very warm reception. A GI was heard to ask, quote, "What are those two goddamn Japs doing over here running around in camp? Shoot them." But someone told him, no, those are good Japs. They work for us. But the GI replied, well, shoot them anyway. They're Japs. But eventually things calmed down. And once these soldiers realized what great work the MIS soldiers were doing, they came to value them and actually asked for their help. Another interesting incident involving Ace over on Guadalcanal involved the famous actor Robert Montgomery. Montgomery was a Navy commander, and he was over on Guadalcanal when he met Ace and Shig, and he asked them where their parents were, and neither one knew. So Montgomery took down their names, and he looked into it and got back to them. And so that was how Ace found out from actor Robert Montgomery that his family was imprisoned at Poston. Ace left Guadalcanal and returned to New Caledonia in April of 43. And after a brief R&R stay on Fiji, where the troops were visited by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, it was on to the Bougainville campaign. And on that upper picture, he's on the far left in the back row on Fiji during his R&R stay. The football picture there on the left, he's in the dead center in the second row wearing the black jersey. But by early 1945, he was in the Philippines. He had been overseas for 37 months, over 3 years, without leave, furlough. He would go on to receive the Bronze Star for his meritorious service in the Pacific. But while he was in the Philippines, 6 MIS soldiers were offered the choice between a field commission to second lieutenant or a furlough home. And Ace was the only soldier to choose the promotion. But he had to take a physical, and he failed that physical when it was revealed he had tuberculosis. And he had been coughing up blood and spitting for quite a while. He was sent back to the Presidio on the next available hospital ship, and he was at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver on VJ Day. He was sent to Denver to be closer to his family because his parents and older brother were living near Salt Lake City at the time. But he was in terrible shape from the TB, from malaria, from having spent 3 years in the tropical jungles and heat of the South Pacific. And when his younger sister went to visit him for the first time in the hospital, she was shocked. She could barely recognize him. When the family moved back to Southern California, Ace was transferred to a VA hospital near Los Angeles that specialized in lung ailments. And he stayed there essentially bedridden for almost 5 years. And then the doctors tried a procedure where they collapsed one of his lungs, and that seemed to help alleviate some of the pressure. And he was finally discharged in 1953. He became part of the family business in Garden Grove, nursery business. He specialized in bonsai and floral arrangements. And with one lung and in poor health, he never really contemplated marriage. He was content to work in the nursery and care for his aging parents. And Ace Kasuda suffered a heart attack and died on October 7, 1981 at the age of 63. And, I couldn't help reading his story and think how, his life trajectory just took such a great change. There he was, athletic, nice looking guy, just graduated from college, had a job lined up, and then he's drafted and his whole life changed. Just a real compelling story, I thought. So the next member of the MIS was Toiko Murakami. And Toiko was the younger brother of Yukito, the first soldier that we looked at. And he was a member of the class of 43, so he was removed to Poston near the end of his junior year. That's him, number 47, in the middle of the picture there. He's with the track team, the JV track team of 1942. And he left Poston in May of 1944, and in November he was inducted into the Army at Fort Leavenworth. I couldn't find an exact record, but I assume he went to the language school because he was assigned to the general headquarters as a translator interpreter of the Pacific Command, the entire Pacific Command in Japan after the war. But as you'll see here, so there he is in 1942. And then sadly, you'll see here in 1946, 4 years later, he was killed tragically in a Jeep accident over in Japan. He was first buried in Yokohama, but then the family brought the body back, and he's buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno. The next soldier from Tustin was Hiroshi Yukagawa. Hiroshi was class of 1942. Like all the others, went to Poston with his family. That's him in the front row, third from the left, kind of with the hair in his eyes. Went to Poston, left there in November of 43, and enlisted in the Army. And he's actually served in an airborne unit. That's the logo for the 515th Parachute Regiment, airborne. He went over to Europe with the unit, with his regiment, but they got there too late. The war ended before they got into action, so they turned him around, and they were on board ship heading to the Pacific when we dropped the bombs on Japan, ending the war. So they never really did see service. And Hiroshi ended up coming back to Southern California, married, raised a family, and he and a brother operated a large tomato farm near Oceanside, California for many years. Next student we're going to look at is Kiyoshi Kitasaki. And Kiyoshi was a younger cousin of the nurse Tomiko, and his family also lived over on the settlement by Bryan and Browning. He was a Tustin High School class of 43, went to Poston in 42, and he was the only one I found who remained there the entire duration of the war. He stayed there until the war was over. And then a year after the war ended, he enlisted in the Army, and he served in the Panama Canal Zone. And then after the war, or after his service, he attended the University of Michigan. He eventually earned a PhD in chemistry. He worked for the Borax Corporation in Garden Grove for a number of years. He even received a U.S. patent for a herbicide he developed. And he's number 6 there. That's the same track team picture as Murakami. He's number 6 in this. Next soldier we'll look at is Jimmy Hara. Jimmy was the Tustin High class of 44. He and his family also lived in that Browning settlement. Of course, they went to Poston. He was there till November of 1944 when he left and enlisted in the Army at Fort Douglas, Utah. He was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, where he drove a truck for the Army. And then records show that he re-enlisted in 1946 and served in Alaska. He returned to Southern California, lived in Gardena for many years, and passed away in 2005. This is Yusao Yoshida, and Tustin High class of 1942. But interesting, his was the only family I found that was not sent to a camp because they left before the internment started, before the removal. There was a 1-month period between the signing of Executive Order 9066 and the removal order in March where actually the Japanese were encouraged to leave, and about 1,000 of them did. Sometimes it was difficult. Some states didn't want them there and actually sent police to the border. Colorado seemed to be more inviting, and that's where Yoshida's family went. And so he was never interned. He's on the bottom right of the second row in the Glee Club picture here of 1942. He actually was working as a farmhand in Colorado in July of 1944 when he enlisted in the Army, and he served in the Medical Corps. And he returned to Southern California after the war, lived in Anaheim for a number of years. He passed away in 2020 at the age of 97. And then the last soldier we have Takeo Tak Murakami, who I believe was a cousin. I haven't quite been able to find out yet, but of the earlier Murakamis. And he Tustin class of 42. He also served in the Army Medical Corps. And the last soldier we're going to look at is Tsutomu Tom Karawatani. And he was from the Tustin class of 42. He only did his senior year there. He came from Capistrano High. And he was removed to Poston with his family in 42. While he was there, he and his older brother actually found work outside of the camp. They picked sugar beets in Utah for a while. His family, as you can see by that one graphic below, they were all sent to Tule Lake. They were transferred to Tule Lake concentration camp up in Northern California in October of 43. And this was done, the people were sent there because they were considered disloyal or troublemakers. It was a maximum security camp. And they went there because there was a questionnaire that was given out in the camps in the summer of 1943 that one of the questions asked if you renounced your loyalty and citizenship to any foreign government, including the Emperor of Japan. And for the Japanese immigrants who were not eligible for citizenship in the U.S., if they had renounced their Japanese citizenship, they would have been people without a country. So Tom's father urged them all not to sign. And so when they didn't, they were considered disloyal and they were sent to Tule Lake, which was much different than Poston. There were many outbreaks of violence there, riots, strikes. The Army actually sent in tanks at one time to quell the violence. So it was not a pleasant experience. Eventually, the father and the 2 older brothers were sent to Department of Justice prison camps outside of Tule Lake. And then eventually the father did renounce the U.S. in 1945 and went back to Japan. And he died there 7 years later without ever seeing his family again. And Tom joined the Army, and he also served in the Medical Corps. And this is just, this was called the final accountability roster of a camp. And my emphasis on this is the final column on the right. It shows how the camps actually broke up families and scattered them all over the country. Because you can see from here, these were all people that were originally from California, and they ended up leaving the camps for Chicago, Missouri, St. Louis, Minneapolis, New York, Cleveland. So the camps not only financially hurt the families, but it broke up formerly close-knit families. Um, so next, I just want to speak a little bit about Fred Korematsu. He's kind of a legend in social justice circles in California. He eventually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but he was he fought the internment at the beginning. He tried to avoid it. He was eventually arrested, but he challenged it in court, and it took several years to go through the court system. So it wasn't until December of 1944 that the Supreme Court ruled on the removal and internment, and it sided with the government. It said it was legal. It was legal, the internment, due to wartime necessity. But it wasn't a unanimous vote. It was a 6-3 decision. And I do want to read um, from one of the dissenting judges' opinions, Justice Frank Murphy. It was a quite eloquent dissent. And he started out by calling the decision legalized racism. And then he went on to quote, racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting, but it is utterly revolting among a free people who have embraced the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States. And all residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood and culture to a foreign land. Yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of this new civilization of the United States. They must accordingly be treated at all times as heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedom granted in the Constitution. After the war, a congressional investigation found that there was no military necessity for the removal and imprisonment, and it stated, quote, racial prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership were responsible for this gross injustice. And then also that same report found that the Japanese and Japanese Americans had lost about 70% of their wealth due to their removal and incarceration. And so when the camps were finally closed by the end of 1945, most of the people still living there were just elder Japanese who had no place to go. But the camps were closed, and those people were given a train ticket and $25. So many people never did come back to Southern California, but also many did. And they, unfortunately, some of them faced discrimination, some of them even violence. And in one famous case here in Orange County was of Kazao Masuda. You might recognize the Masuda name. That's who the VFW post in Garden Grove was named after. And Masuda was killed in action over in Italy, and he received a Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, and he was buried over in Italy. So his family at this time was in the Gila River camp. So when the war ended, they wanted to come back to their farm, which is a place that was then called Talbert, now known as Fountain Valley. So they sent the oldest daughter back to check out conditions. And while she was here, 5 men approached her and threatened her, told her and her family not to come back if they knew what was good for them. Somehow this got out, and General Joseph Stilwell, famous U.S. Army general of the war, found out about it, and he was just incensed because Masuda hadn't served under him, but he had Stilwell had many MIS soldiers under him in India and Burma and China. And so he made a point of coming to Talbert, Fountain Valley, and personally pinning the DSC on Masuda's sister. And it was quite an event. You can see there were all three radio networks were there covering it. And there was also an Army captain named Ronald Reagan who spoke at the ceremony. But the story doesn't just end there. The family eventually had Masuda's body brought back to Southern California, and they wanted to bury him at Westminster Memorial Park. But they were told, no, we can't do that. We have a racial covenant. Only whites buried here. Somehow Stilwell also found out about that, and he had it changed, overruled. So Masuda's buried there, and if you've ever been over there, there's many, many people of Japanese ancestry buried there. So the years went by, and there was a lobbying for reparations, and it took until 1988 under the what was called the Civil Liberties Act that was signed by President Ronald Reagan, and it set aside $1.2 million for reparations, and that amounted to about $20,000 for each of the estimated 80,000 survivors from the camps who had been imprisoned. And that really seems like a pittance when you compare how much they lost and what they went through, but it was more symbolic. It was the idea that the government apologized and admitted that they had done wrong. And so now to bring it all back to Tustin High School, I told you we'd come back to George and Miko. So here they are. This is them in their junior year at Tustin High School. In May of that year, they both were sent to Poston, their families. George, of course, then went off to the Army. Afterwards, he went and was living in Long Beach with his parents. But in 1950, he and Miko reconnected. They were married in 1950. They were together for 65 years, 4 children and 7 grandchildren. In December of 2014, they ran into a former classmate, Denny Hayden, who was an attorney here in Tustin. And they got to talking, and Hayden realized from their story that they never got to graduate. They never got their diplomas. So he contacted the school district and arranged for them to be able to graduate with the next graduating class. So in June of 2015, 72 years after their other classmates had graduated, George and Miko got to walk in cap and gown and receive their diplomas. You can see on the picture they're thrilled. I thought a nice touch was their diplomas. Tustin had dropped the Union from its name back in around 63, but their diplomas were made up to Tustin Union High School, which is what it was called when they should have graduated in 1943. So one last thought on this whole removal and incarceration. I just think that it shows that in times of crisis, we need to be hyper vigilant that we do not let our fears and our prejudices drive our actions. Something like this should have never happened in America, and it should definitely never happen again. That's it.
Okay, great, man. Great.
Where do I stop it?
Okay. In recording.
Oh, shh.